in the last close place, besides for talking about how a roof can be potentially problematic, we also spoke about how the roof has a minimum width in order for it to convey the impurity, which is about a tefach, which is about 3.5 centimeters, 3.5 inches rather, about 5, 6, 7 centimeters. And so one of the things that Jeff and I were looking at. We mentioned in our last class that there's a tiny, tiny little overhang around the side of the Chevra Kadisha building. It's not really an overhang. It's more like a molding. It's not wide enough to be a problem. And as such, you're not sharing any kind of roof space. You're not sharing any shelter. No problem. You can go in, you can go out. And they probably did consult with somebody before they built the Cohen's room the way that they did.
I saw it. Worried. I made it.
All right. Very good. Very, very good. Okay, so right now we're going to talk about a very complicated aspect of how impurity gets spread around. So we spoke about how if you have a closed door, the door will impede the impurity from spreading. So this means, for example, that if I'm standing in the social hall, I'm a Kohen, I can end the social hall, and in the sanctuary, there is a mace, there's a dead body, there's a funeral taking place, even if it's not in the sanctuary proper, it's on the outside part of the mechitza, in the vestibule section. Um, the as long as the door is closed, then there's something that impedes or stops the impurity from spreading. Yes, we're in the same building, but if there is if there's some kind of a blockage in the space in between, such as a door, that will prevent the impurity from spreading from the sanctuary into the social hall. So a Kohen would technically be able to remain in that space. It's not necessarily recommended because you will always have the kids running around. Even nowadays, it's becoming more and more common for children to be present at funerals and unveilings, to my consternation. But they're there. They're running around. They're opening doors. Not everybody observes signs. So if you have a sign that says "Please do not open the door," and they might open the door, it's not entirely recommended. I wouldn't recommend that people do that, but it is a possibility. We're going to discuss now is that there is still a complication. Even with a closed door, there still could be a problem. And that's the issue of sof tuma lotzes, which we'll explain immediately. So let's take a look. Again, page 23. Sof tuma lotzes. So we read, exits and passageways through which the deceased will be removed, even if they're currently not exposed to the tumas mace, even if the doors are closed, are considered tameh. This halacha is known as sof tuma lotzes, which literally means in the end the tuma will exit. So what does this mean? In the original plans for the house of Jacob, there was supposed to be a second door in the social hall. If you can take a look and you could see that this was part of the original plan, that there would be another sort of side door. The door that the place where we have out back where the sukkah, probably it was thought that there'd be some kind of something like a little courtyard to the side, and there would be a area on what would that be, the south side of the building. Let's imagine that plan was actualized and there is a door that goes through the social hall. There is a door on the other end of the social hall. So in that case, you have the deceased in the sanctuary and you have the Kohen in the social hall with the doors closed and there are no kids running around. Everything's locked. Never the twain shall meet. Everything is seemingly kosher v'yosher. Before the hearse, before the body's loaded onto the hearse, it's deemed that the front doors are too slippery, it's the winter, and it's safer, it's easier, it's better for the mace to be taken out the social hall. So what happens? The Kohanim leave the social hall through that door. They're now no longer sharing the roof, but the mace now goes through that door. That means that since there was a plan, and the example that I've given is not a fantastic example of this. If it was the original plan that the mace go through the social hall, even with all the doors closed, the closed doors are not considered barriers. So the Kohen should not be in that place, in that room at the time.
It's about intention.
It's about intention. So let's talk about a more practical example. Let's imagine that there was an overhang over the Kohen's room that was shared with the back door at the Chevra Kadisha. That mace was always going to go through that door and go out that back way to the electric conveyance machine. I don't know what is properly called. A Kohen would not be allowed to remain under the overhang at any point, even if the mace was still inside, even with the door closed, because the closed door doesn't count, because the mace was always supposed to go through that door. The closed door was never considered closed. So the overhang was always present. You always shared a shelter with the mace. So let's go back into the book. The Rishonim, meaning the medieval authorities, they debate the source of this law because this is a very bizarre ruling. If the mace isn't here and the door is closed, why would the door be considered open if the mace practically is not present? What is the source of this? Because it's a very wonky concept. Some say that it's a rabbinic enactment in order to prevent the possibility of ever sharing a roof with with the deceased, while others maintain that this is what's called a halacha lemoshe misinai, which is an oral tradition that we received from Moses, even if it is not scriptural. So on page 24. So even if it's not scriptural, it's a oral tradition that explains how tuma is generated and how it is spread about. So now he gives some of the examples, and we already covered some of these examples, but we'll see. He says comparable things. An example of sof tuma lotzes would be if a person passed away in a multi-unit building. Since the body will be removed through the front hallway, for example, it's considered as if the tuma is actually in the hallway, even if the doors are closed. If the mace was always going to go throughout that hallway, even other rooms that open to that hallway, even as long as if they're open, but the door where the deceased individual actually is closed, it would still be a conveyance of the impurity because the body will eventually be taken through that hallway. Another example would be if a person passed away in a multi-floor apartment building. Applying the principle of sof tuma lotzes, the hallways and stairwells are all considered to be impure. However, any apartment whose front door remains closed until the deceased is removed from the building would be tahor. So if the door would be open to the hallway, since the mace is going to be taken out through that hallway, down that stairwell, out the door, any door that opens to it and is open is considered to be connected, even if the place where the mace is, its door is closed. Any door that will be opened to allow the mace to pass through is not considered to be a closed door. So if I have apartment B where the mace is not, and apartment A where the mace is, and they're connected by a hallway, if apartment B's door is open to the hallway, then it is considered to be sharing in the impurity, even though the door to apartment A is closed, because eventually the mace will be taken through that door from apartment A into the hallway to the outside. Much like we discussed, that any door that will be opened to convey the mace is not considered closed, or it's never considered closed. Therefore, the hallway is considered still to be connected. He says, if we're just going to skip a couple lines. I did go through this, and the next few lines over here are unnecessarily complicated. So we're just going to go to the bottom line. If all the exits are closed and it's uncertain which exit will be used to remove the mace, they are all tame because of this principle. Wherever there's a possibility, let's say, for example, there are two ways the mace could be removed from apartment A. It could go through it can go through the emergency stairwell, or it can go through the regular stairwell. And it's not certain which one we're going to use, then they're both considered to be connected. The doors are considered to be open, even when they are closed. However, once an exit route has been determined, the other areas and doorways that are not open to that exit route are considered to be tahor. We can do this. We can take a look at figure 11. Now, sometimes the figures are helpful. This is actually an example of where the figure is helpful only if you sort of read its description at the same time. So we're going to be turning. So you should see for those of you who are looking, it's on page 90 of the of the diagram section of the handout. So this is figure 10 and 11. So it says above it is example of Sof Tuma Lotse. So let's take a look. Room A and its closet are tame. So you see room here on the top left and has a closet just below the deceased body, and the door there is open. They're both impure because they're both connected. The hall is also tame due to sof tuma lotzes, because even though the door is closed, since the door will be open for the for the evacuation of the mace, since it will be open, we don't consider that door to be closed. Room B on the top right-hand side, you'll notice has an open door. Even though the door to room A is closed, the hallway is still considered to be connected. And since the doorway to room B is open, room B is also connected. Meanwhile, room C with its closed door, since the mace is not going to go through that door at all, it's still considered to be isolated and still considered to be pure. Um, so let's continue. If it has not yet been decided where the body should exit, both hallways are tame due to sof tumalotze. So let's take a look at the bottom picture on the bottom left. So on the bottom left, you have the deceased. He's in room A, and you'll see that there are two different hallways. There's room A, there's hall A, excuse me, and hall B. Hall A is just above the room, and room B is just to the east of the room. So you'll see that there is, you have two exits, exit A and exit B. You all see it? So since it's uncertain which exit the mace is going to be conveyed, they're both considered to be impure. And because room B, which is on the very top, has an open door, the impurity spreads into there as well. As opposed to on the right-hand section, where you know for a fact where it's going to go out, it only affects that that hall B, because you know that was already determined that is where the person is going to be conveyed. Make sense? Follow?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is Sof Tuma
Latzet.
Latzet, is it like a Siag La Torah?
So if it's rabbinic, yes. If it's a halacha l'Moshe Missinai, then it's something else.
Okay.
It's something else. I guess it's that probably what I would imagine the best way to explain it is, we spoke about how you could have a closed door that is considered to be a boundary. It blocks the impurity. If the mace will be conveyed through that door, it's sort of we don't consider that door to be a boundary, even if it's closed. It's not preventing, it doesn't stop the impurity.
Yeah.
So it's like the impurity spreads and it only is bound up by boundaries that are considered, I guess, to be permanent or something along those lines. If the mace is if that boundary is not actually going to hold the deceased in situ, then it's not considered to be a valid blockage or impediment for the impurity. So I would think it's the what would be called the Balabatish way to explain it. There's the way that if you take a look at the halachic works that talk about it, they use a lot of complicated language that is incomprehensible to me, anyways. Go ahead, please.
I can ask.
You can ask whatever you like.
Okay. I've only been inside the Chevra Kadisha's place on 37th Street once. There was nobody, and Renee and I were buying real estate. And I don't know if the places where the Tahara is done is either in a basement or in a side room. But let's say for the moment that there is a mate being uh, treated, being given tahara inside a closed door room. Am I correct in thinking that it, because the decision to move, the movement of the mate will be, I don't know, say 2 days later, the funeral's called for 2 days later. Does Sof Tuma Latzeit count for that, or is it only immediate? And secondly, could you walk into the building if, for example, there was some other way that the mate was going to be moved? Can you be in the same building after all?
So there's several factors here. The question, the ultimate pro, it probably would be an issue because where you had your conversation probably in the office,
The office.
right? And it would probably be in the office. And because the mace would be brought upstairs to the main chapel, where all those doors remain open.
Okay, may I
Yeah.
interrupt? I'm thinking specifically, there's a mate. It may be the funeral hasn't even been decided
So the
yet.
question is if the funeral's not going to take place in several days.
Yeah, and
S-
can you, and the door is closed to wherever the mate is, and there's no expected movement.
Yeah, so there are some opinions. There are some opinions about that. Like, for example, at night when burials don't take place, or on Shabbos when don't take place, there are some opinions that say Sof Tumalot is not a consideration when the burial is not going to take place
Okay.
because it has to do with when there's a mitzvah for burial. We'll talk about that. We'll get to that. We'll get
Okay.
that. That is discussed. We'll get to that
Okay.
soon. Anyways, um, the rule. So we're on page 25. The rule. Let everybody get back to our page. The rule is only of sof tuma latzeit, that in the end the tuma will exit. However, not sof tuma lichnas, in the end the tuma will enter. Therefore, if the deceased is going to be brought into a building, the building remains tahor until the body actually enters it. This is only the case while the body's there, and it will be removed, not some place where the body will eventually be brought in. And that actually is going to come up momentarily as we're going to see that the discussion that some of the earlier Rishonim discuss. Likewise, if there were an overhang over the exit in the area under the right under the o, over an exit, the area under the overhang is tame, even when the door is closed because of sof tumah. It says, like we said before, since the body will be removed through here, the door is not considered to be a valid barrier, and the impurity is conveyed. However, if the deceased were under the overhang and the door is closed, the tuma would not enter the building. Right? Sof tuma, let's say, does not bring tuma in. It only allows tuma to sort of to be generated outwards. We'll continue. Some explain the reason for sof tumlotses in the following manner. Since there is a mitzvah to bury the deceased, and one must bury it as soon as possible, it's considered as if the deceased is leaving now. Even before it has departed, it's in the process of being transported because there's that halachic imperative, bury the dead, and as such, it's considered as though it's already on the way. Accordingly, any item for which there is no obligation to bury, the law of Sof Tumalot says is not applicable. However, others do not agree with this determination. So I'm not entirely certain what he means. What's an example? There are some examples of where there is a where you don't have an obligation to bury the dead, but there is a impurity that is generated. So, for example, if you have if there was an accident, chas v'shalom, and a person, a part, like a limb of a person's body, or some flesh was severed from the body, and the flesh that we're dealing with is less than the size of an olive. If it's the size of an olive, it can generate impurity, but we don't necessarily have an imperative to bury it immediately. It has to be just slightly larger. It has to be more than the size of a kezias. So that would be an example where you perhaps have an imperative to, you don't have an imperative to bury, but an impurity is being generated. So if you're going to say that it's all about the obligation to bury in a situation such as this, you would not necessarily have the sof tuma lotzes as a part of this. But it's not, but others don't agree with this determinations that that's not the rationale. But it is it's just it is something that does get discussed a lot, in fact. Some say the principle of sof tuma lotzes was said only with regards to a Jewish, if the deceased were Jewish, and that the rule of sof to malotses doesn't apply to a non-Jewish body. Others disagree. That's centered perhaps around the idea again about the obligation to bury. We don't necessarily have the same level of obligation to bury a non-Jewish body, but there isn't mitzvah to bury a Jewish body. No, we
There's
want
no
to do.
beit mitzvah for a non-Jew.
I wouldn't say that there's no mate mitzvah. We have a civil obligation. We have a covenant brios obligation. Um, we don't necessarily have, and we also just you don't want dead bodies decomposing around you. It's not healthy. It's not safe. Yes, they should be buried and we should be involved. But the idea of the mace mitzvah, for example, where a Kohen who's not
Okay.
supposed to get involved in the burial, perhaps doesn't apply. I would argue that maybe there's a sakana consideration. If nobody else is going to do it, then you might end up with a situation where people's lives and health are in danger. Um, Often, I'm not sure if there's a mace mitzvah consideration
Okay.
for dead body. But if we're going to say that it's only a rabbinic edict, again, also then rabbinic edicts don't necessarily always apply to non-Jewish um, just Jewish graves,
Yeah.
bodies, and so it sort of gets shunted to a side. But that's only according to these opinions. Others disagree. Hey, Jeff, how's it going? Here, thank you. I'm happy you're here. I was worried.
Let it burn. Let it burn. Your hand.
I'm trying something for I got like
Oh.
Okay, right. So here we're on the very, very bottom of page 26. The Maharit says that on Shabbos, if the corpse isn't going to remove, then there's no sof to malotzes. That was basically what you were discussing. If because the burial is not going to be taking place on Shabbos, then it's not considered to be since it's not about to happen, it's not the impurity is not conveyed.
So, I mean, if I can just be more specific about that, I'm testing the boundaries of this. The mate is inside the Chevra Kadisha building. The door is closed. It's Friday. There's no funeral till Sunday. A Kohen can enter the building because
The doors are closed.
the doors are closed and there's no flow of tuma outside of the building, even though you're under the
Outside the room.
I'm sorry, outside of the room, despite the fact that you're under the same roof.
Right, exactly.
Amazing.
Yes.
Okay.
Now this is what I mentioned earlier about the Trumas Hadeshin. The Trumas Hadeshin. So who was Trumas Hadeshin? This was Rabbi Isserlein Yisrael. So he lived in the 1300s in Germany. He was one of the last of the students of the Baal HaTosafos. And he wrote a book called the Trumas Hadeshin. The Trumas Hadeshin is a reference to the ashes that were removed from the altar. The Trumas, to be separation or the removal of the Deshin of the ashes. Um, he wrote a fascinating responsa full of questions that he very skillfully answers, except that this was a book of responsa. Most rabbis, when they write responsa, they're collecting the questions that they've been asked and their written responses to them. these were the questions that he wished he had been asked. And he wrote an entire book about it. It was really, really interesting man. Like, and he's also quite formative in normative Ashkenazi practice. A lot of the things that Ashkenazim do, that are different than other groups of Jews, many of them are perhaps not traced to him as the originator, but as the codifier, as one who talks about this is what we do here in Frankfurt on Main. That's what they do over there in Spire. You know, he talks about Ashkenazi practices and he brings the halachic justification and explanation, essentially codifying them. And so a lot of the things that you hear that Ashkenazim do, for example, davening Mariv early, like that's something that is a uniquely Ashkenazi practice. We make an early Shabbos. It's not universally approved of, but it's something that Ashkenazim have done forever. And the Trumas Hadeshin is really the one who talks about it. And whenever people talk about doing a mitzvah, a night mitzvah early, they always cite the Trumas Hadeshin as the justification for why that should be acceptable. Even though perhaps he's not the originator of the practice, he's the one essentially who codified the practice, who describes it, justifies it, explains it, provides a sort of the legal framework for it. And so he's a very, very important halachic authority. I mean, if you were to take a look, for example, if you open up a Shulchan Aruch of the Shulchan Aruch, and you look at the commentaries, the Trumas Hadeshin is one of the most frequently cited Rishonim, the most frequently recited medieval authorities, or early authorities. He's right on the edge of when the age of the Rishonim was coming to an end and the age of the Achronim was beginning. In fact, some people consider him to be an Achron. Very, very, very interesting man. Very, very important halachic authority. But he discusses an opinion here, we're on page 27, that Kohanim may not exit courtyard gates and city gates that the mace will travel through on the way to the cemetery because of the principle of sof, tuma, lotzes. Right? Because since the body will be there at some point, it's not that therefore it now will convey an impurity even before the mace arrives. Now that actually flies in the face of something we said earlier, right? We said sof tuma lotzes, but not sof tuma lichnas. So the tuma will leave the building. It won't. We don't you apply this rule to say that the impurity will enter the building to convey the impurity to a building where the body is not. So this actually runs afoul of this. We'll have to see. One of the explanations given as to there. If you turn the page, actually, we'll take a look at the footnote. Footnote 104. This is page 28. So the Pischei Tshuva quotes from the Maharit that the reason for this minhag is not because of sof tuma lotzes, right? Because that would not convey the impurity, as we said before. Rather, because of a concern that the Kohen and the deceased will unknowingly enter the door at the same time. There's a worry that perhaps, maybe they'll find themselves sharing a roof as they're sort of on their way as part of a procession to the graveside. So it's not the sof tuma lotzes consideration. Perhaps the minhag is based on a different consideration, which is perhaps a bit more legitimate. Let's go back. The Trumas Hadeshin discussed the opinion that Kohanim may not exit a courtyard gates and city gates that a mace or the deceased will travel through on their way to the cemetery because of the principle of sof tuma lotzes. Again, the idea that even a closed door will not prevent the impurity from traveling if the body will be taken out, it'll be conveyed via this evacuation. He says that in his area, they did not have this custom. Again, he's focused a lot on customs and practices of particular places. And he explains that Rashi's opinion is that sof tuma lotzes is a halach l'Moshe Sinai. It's a oral tradition that was conveyed to Moshe and transmitted to us from Har Sinai. The halach l'Moshe Sinai refers only to the exit through which the mace or the deceased will be taken from inside to outside, like we said before, since it's through that doorway that the ohel, will become tahor, meaning to say that the body will be removed from the room and the room will no longer convey impurity, but not any other doorways beyond that point.
I'm having trouble with the logic.
It means to say that the only time that we say sof tu malotses is a consideration is if it involves removing a body from a room, because by removing the body from the room, you will render the room now pure once again.
And what's the problem? I don't get the problem.
That contradicts what the Trumas Hadeshin was saying, where he says that even a room, even for example, a place where there is, for example, where there's the mesa's outside, it's like on the road. There's no impurity, there's no room, and it's about to go into under a gate, a gateway, right? So there's the only time that we say sof tu malotses is if we're vacating a space and rendering that space that was previously impure pure. But however, if you're in a space where there's no impurity, I mean, because you're not inside a room, then that sof tu malotses is not a consideration. It's only about removing a body from a location where there is impurity versus a situation like this when there is no, when there's no such consideration.
So who was Truman Edition?
So the Trumas Hadeshin says there is a custom where he says, but in my region, we don't have this custom. It's based on Rashi, who understands sof tu malotses to be very specific to this type of a situation and no other situation. This is the Trumas Hadeshin talking about all of it.
Somebody else. Okay.
No, it's the Trumas Hadeshin saying the reason why in my location we don't have this custom is because of the opinion of Rashi.
Okay.
Right. Right.
What for? I'm not sure I can handle
Well, this is
another complication. Okay.
And it was the Rama says that in the locale where there's no such custom to be stringent, one may be lenient. So that's the contemporary practice. That's what everybody else knows. I'm not aware of anyone who says you can never go under any roof where a mace might possibly be conveyed. That would make life exceptionally difficult.
Yeah.
All right. Now, 28. New topic, new discussion. A Kohen that's in a building and hears that there is somebody is deceased inside, they must leave immediately without delay. However, if the Kohen is in a sealed apartment or room, he should stay where he is, as entering the hallway will cause him to become tameh, either directly through sharing a roof or through the sof tu malotses consideration that the hallway, since it'll be used for the conveyance of the deceased, now shares the impurity even with closed doors. Also, a Kohen that enters an ohel mace or a cemetery accidentally upon finding out must leave immediately. If he doesn't leave immediately, then he's perhaps transgressing a biblical prohibition. So if you find yourself standing under a tree where you're sharing a grave with that also shelters a grave, and somebody says you should clear out from underneath that branch, and the person says, "Nah, I'm good," that individual has transgressed perhaps a biblical prohibition. There is some discussion whether it's biblical or only rabbinic. But let's continue. The Trumas Hadeshin discusses a Kohen who is sleeping in a building and awakes to the news that there's somebody who's passed away within the building. The Trumas Hadeshin rules that he must leave the building immediately, even before adequately dressing. That's the concept of kavod abrius, which is dignity. Dignity flies out the window when it comes to biblical prohibitions, according to the Trumas Hadeshin. So he says that you have the minimum covering, and then you leave. There are many halachic authorities who dispute this ruling of the Trumas Hadeshin. They say that one should wake a sleeping Kohen. You wake them up and say, "Hey, Milton, get dressed." But you don't tell them why they should get dressed or that they have to leave. So that in that way, you're able to adequately get dressed. And now that you're dressed, to say, "Okay, you got to leave the building because there's a body in the building." That way, it's only a shoge, so it's inadvertent or accidental transgression. We work around the Trumas Hadeshin. If the Kohen is in an area where the tuma is only rabbinic, he may get dressed first. Remember, we said that kavod habrios, the idea of human dignity, comes into play. That comes into play much more directly and much more impactfully when it comes to a rabbinic prohibition. So if it's only a rabbinic prohibition, like for example, it's a non-Jewish somebody the person is not Jewish, where we say that um, that it's only a rabbinic sort of ohel. It's only the shared shelter, the shared roof consideration is only rabbinic. Um, we say that you can get dressed first. You can even be told why you have to leave, but you can get dressed first. If a child is sleeping, one need not wake him up because the child who's a Kohen does not have a biblical obligation. We have an obligation to educate them, but that obligation to educate them does not require us to wake them up. They can remain a shogeg. We don't force them to get up. You can, but there's no obligation to. Kohanim have no right to force the removal of a corpse to expedite their re-entry into a building, even to do a mitzvah. However, if the Kohen is sick and is unable to leave, and there's no way to isolate the impurity or the tuma, the family of this deceased can be forced to remove the corpse. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about on Shabbos. That on Shabbos, you're really a mace, a person who's passed away is considered to be muktzah. We don't move a mace unnecessarily unless it's to protect the dignity of the deceased. They're considered muksa. We leave them where they are generally, except we will move them from one location to another, sort of like, if they're on the floor, we might move them to a bed. We'll cover up. We'll do a number of things. We'll move them out of the sun so that they don't start to decompose. But there's a way to do it. But generally, we don't remove the body from the building. We kind of leave it where it is. We'll act to protect its dignity. A Kohen, in this case over here, who is unable to leave the building, can demand that the mace be removed, being that because the Kohen himself cannot get up to leave. In that case, we can actually we'll move the body. Again, it'll have to be done in a halachic way. There are ways to do it, but we would perhaps remove the body from this situation in which it is in the location where it is, to facilitate to accommodate this Kohen who is unable to remove himself or to extricate himself from these circumstances. Generally, the Kohen cannot demand that the body be removed or that the body be relocated. That's generally the case, except in a situation such as this where the Kohen can't move. Then we would, in fact, have to move. We would move the deceased in order to prevent a different sort of prohibition, and that also is considered to be a form of kavod hames, protecting the dignity of the deceased, because in that case we're preventing the deceased from forcing an impurity on a Kohen or forcing a prohibition on a Kohen who's unable to extricate themselves from the circumstance. That's considered to be a form of respect to the deceased, that the deceased's body is not creating a prohibition. You don't want people resenting the mace, right? There's no greater indignity to the mace than people saying, "Darn that dead person who's now causing a inconvenience for my life." Or is creating issues for me. That's considered to be a form of, degradation to the dignity of the individual as well. So in that case, we would remove the body in that circumstance, in that scenario. All right, we'll stop here and we will continue next week.
One last sentence.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that.
Okay.
The area there is complicated and has to do also with a social reality that existed before modern medicine, and that is the state of infants who pass away within the first 30 days of birth, and whether or not they were ever considered they were never considered viable, and there's a whole sort of if they were never viable, kavod habrios is not as great a consideration, but to an extent, it's no longer the a halachic consideration, primarily because it's very rare to find a baby that will not survive 30 days. So this is really touching on a difficult thing to discuss, especially as it's not a social reality that we live in. It's a complicated topic, and it's can also be very traumatic, and people's emotions can run very high. So I'd really rather perhaps we'll go off record and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But we'll conclude the class here, and we'll continue next week. Yasher koach, everyone.
Go ahead, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right, thank you, Maria. It's good to see you.
Thank you.